first words out of their mouth are, help, my child has experienced trauma, or not. The idea that you would use a checklist to make this diagnosis is borderline offensive, absolutely useless. The human brain is one of the most...
What you just watched, that's the breaking point. But you haven't seen the medical evidence that led here. What really happened to 2-month-old Kalen Garner during the hours he was alone with his father? This is the state versus Luther Garner. It looks like a simple accident involving a door frame, but it's really about a dying infant left alone while his father reportedly watched Jerry Springer. Why did Luther wait hours to call for help while his son's eyes rolled back? Why did the accident story only appear a week after the baby was hospitalized? At stake is a lifetime in prison for a man who claims the medical science used to convict him is wrong. If you want to understand courtroom psychology and how medical experts catch a lie in real time, hit subscribe to see how justice really works in the cases most people miss. Let's see how this unfolded.
Mr. Coleman, you may call your next witness.
This time the state called Dr. Daniel Lindberg.
Dr. Lindberg. How are you, sir?
Thanks
Yeah.
for that.
And if you'll just make sure that green light's on the microphone on the left side. Go ahead.
Thank you, Honor. Would you please state your full name for the court reporter?
Daniel Lindberg, the last name is spelled Lindberg.
And Dr. Lindberg, how are you employed, sir?
I'm a professor of emergency medicine and pediatrics at the University of Colorado and the Kemp Center for the Prevention and Treatment of Child Abuse and Neglect.
And your training and background that has led you to hold that position, could you briefly summarize it for the court, please?
Did my undergraduate degree in biochemistry at Harvard University. I went to med school at the University of Chicago Pritzker School of Medicine. I did a residency in emergency medicine at the University of Cincinnati. I did a fellowship in child abuse pediatrics at Cincinnati Children's Hospital Medical Center. And I've been practicing in emergency medicine and child abuse pediatrics since then. I finished my fellowship in 2006.
And you are board certified, correct?
I'm board certified in emergency medicine, yes.
And have you been an instructor in the past at an instructor of medicine at Harvard?
Yes, I was an instructor and then an assistant professor of emergency medicine at Harvard University Medical School.
And we won't go into all of the details, but you received numerous awards throughout your career. Is that fair to say?
Correct.
And you've served on various committees, correct?
Yes, sir.
What I do want to mention is some particular research that you've done or types of research that you've done, and why is it noteworthy? Could you expound on that, please?
About half of my job is to see patients in emergency departments and as a consultant for the Kemp Center Child Protection Team. The other half of my job is as a clinical researcher. My research has been funded by the NIH, the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, the Department of Defense, the State of Colorado, and other various foundations. And that's important because there's different kinds of research. There's reading papers that other people write, and then there's actually conducting the research studies. And I think it's important to distinguish those two.
Sure. And during the testimony of Dr. Yu, the name of Dr. Sandeep Narang came up, and Dr. Yu testified about how respected or highly regarded he thinks of him. What, if any, opinion do you have about Dr. Sandeep Narang?
I've worked with Dr. Narang on a couple different studies, most importantly, a survey of clinicians who care for children who may have experienced abusive head trauma. And I have found him to be a very responsible and dedicated researcher. I have a lot of respect for his results.
And the two of you worked on some publications in the past together, correct?
Yes, sir.
And I mentioned Dr. Narang for this one reason in your resume, is the fact that as respected as he is, and I know that you're a humble person, I'll get the impression that you like to toot your own horn, but as respected as he is, you list in your resume that you actually mentored him between 2014 and 2019, right?
I would consider it peer mentorship. He certainly taught me things, but I had been doing research for a few more years than him, and so I helped him, especially with that survey project.
You also mentioned in your resume that you've published peer review articles or papers in journals to the tune of about 111. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You testified in court on few or on many occasions?
Uh, I haven't kept count, but I suspect since my fellowship, I've testified more than 24 times.
And have you testified as an expert witness?
Yes, sir.
All right. So much for your background. Let's talk about your work in this particular case. Were you asked to review certain records and a case file as it relates to the death of a 2-month-old? He was 2 months old when he was injured. I think about 11-month-old when he ultimately expired. The child's name is Kaylin Garner. Did you review those records?
I did, sir.
And briefly for the court, what did those records entail?
I reviewed Kaylin Garner's medical records at the time of his initial hospitalization and subsequent stay in the intensive care unit and the hospital. I reviewed initial case findings and legal arguments. I reviewed arguments made in the request for the writ of habeas corpus. I reviewed some pictures, laboratory results. That may not be a complete list.
Okay. Included in that information, was there a reference or references to the state or the circumstances surrounding how Kaylin Garner was discovered back in February 2000?
Yes.
What's your understanding after reviewing those records of how that all happened?
My understanding is that Kaylin Garner was reported to be in his normal state of health at the time that his mother left for work between 5 and 6 in the morning on the 25th of February, and that between 2 and 3 o'clock, a CPS worker came to his house for an unannounced visit, at which time it was noted by his father and the caseworker that he was obviously very ill. He was then taken to an emergency department.
Let me jump in there real quick, Dr. Lindberg. His father being Luther Garner, the defendant in this case.
That's my understanding.
And Luther Garner being sole caregiver for Kaylin after the mother left for work that day.
That's my understanding, yes.
Please continue.
So he was taken to an emergency department where the clinicians there thought that he was having seizures and found him to be critically ill. He was given medicine to treat seizures. He underwent diagnostic testing, most important of which was probably the CAT scan of his head, which showed severe brain injury. And then he was taken to Texas Children's Hospital.
Let's back up about to the delay in providing medical treatment by Luther Garner. Are we talking about a matter of minutes, or are we talking a matter of hours? As your understanding from reviewing the file.
So my understanding is that the time that Kaylin started to show symptoms changed with different stories, and that initially when the CPS worker presented and when the history was given to the initial emergency department, the story was that Kaylin had just started to make some funny noises while he was sleeping, or he was breathing funny. And that it seems that the initial story was that he was taken for care soon after he began to have symptoms. But that subsequently, later versions of the story said that he became ill around 10 a.m. when Jerry Springer was on television. And the thought was to wait until his mother got home from work, or there were other things that were done to try and get him back to normal. And so it's unclear whether the delay was several hours or several minutes. But I think by the time the initial case was tried, the accepted story was that it had been several hours.
And in your training experience, diagnosing abusive head trauma cases in infants, is a delay. What is a delay in seeking medical attention potentially indicative of?
So the research suggests that a delay in seeking care that is not reasonable is a strong indication for abuse. Now, there's some complexity, and I hope you forgive me for going into some of the details on this. Most people have had a child who's had maybe an injury or even a broken bone, and it's very common for a child to break a bone, in the evening, they say they fall off their bike or have a minor injury, and parents to go, oh, let's give them some Tylenol, see how they're doing in the morning. My boss even sent his child to school with a broken bone. This is a pediatrician, and later ended up finding out that the child's sore foot was actually a broken bone. That's not something that we get very excited about. It's difficult to communicate these sorts of details to people who don't practice child abuse pediatrics all the time. But when a child has an obvious injury, like they're not breathing correctly or they're seizing, or the other clear example is if they've got a gigantic burn and someone says, well, I wanted to wait till someone else got home from work, or I wanted to wait for something else. That, I think, both from the research and as a parent and common sense, it suggests that someone's motivations are something different than my child is ill and I want to get them help as soon as I possibly can.
Fair point. What about exhibiting symptoms of eyes rolling in the back of their head?
Yes, I mean, I think things that could be seizures and breathing differently are the classic example of something where most reasonable parents would seek help because they know that the child is very ill. And when you don't do that, that has been strongly associated both in common sense and in research with other findings of abuse.
Very good. And in fact, the CPS caseworker that showed up unannounced and discovered Kaylin in the state immediately took Kaylin to the emergency room. Is that your understanding?
That's my understanding from review of the records, that there was some discussion between Luther and Miss Ruby, and Miss Ruby said, we have to go right now.
Let's talk about what was discovered once at the hospital. The initial CT scan, what did it show?
The CT scan showed devastating brain injury throughout most of Kaylin's brain. This is referred to in multiple different ways. They'll talk about hypodensity, they'll talk about swelling, they'll talk about anoxia, all sorts of medical terms. But what this means is that most of Kaylin's brain was severely injured and not doing well.
What is that indicative of in your training experience of?
Well, it certainly, you wouldn't look at a CAT scan and make a diagnosis without the rest of the information. There are several things that can cause this sort of swelling and brain injury. If it was just in one section of the brain, you might think about a stroke. Certainly, that's much less common in a 2.5-month-old. It's older people like me start to be at risk for that sort of thing. Drowning, strangulation, or significant trauma, including the possibility of shaking.
Eventually, from your reading of the record or the documents, a final story emerged of accidentally hitting Kaylin's head on a door frame. What is your, if taken true, your thoughts on that?
That story was very concerning to me for several reasons. The first is it's that I wouldn't expect that sort of injury to cause the findings that we see on the CAT scan. Children who have a single impact against a door frame, first of all, it's usually not a lot of force if that happens. Second of all, it's not a common story I see when I'm working in the emergency department of children having to come in because while they're being carried, they strike their head against the door frame. But also, it wasn't offered to the people who were caring for Kaylin at the time.
What do you mean?
I mean, that story was not given to the emergency clinicians when Kaylin got to the emergency department. Throughout the entire chart, for days and days and days, the story is this child was brought to the hospital because he was breathing funny. No one says, oh, also there was trauma. And in my experience, when someone is concerned that their child has experienced trauma, the first words out of their mouth are, help, my child has experienced trauma, or help, this happened to my child and I'm concerned they're hurt. Not, help, my child's breathing funny, and then later, oh, right, they hit their head. To me, both in common sense as a clinician and in the research, that sort of change in history is very suggestive of abuse.
Okay, so this story about the door frame was never given to the medical professionals. Who was that story ultimately given to?
My understanding from review of the records is that the story was given to the detective approximately 1 week after Kaylin went to the hospital.
And with all of this, these circumstances, this allegation or assertion that the baby hit his head on a door frame, the lack of providing that information initially to the medical professionals, the delay in seeking medical treatment, and the ultimately providing that information to law enforcement only. Would all that consist of or comprise of the patient history?
I mean, not to split hairs with you, sir, but it's the history, the laboratory findings, the physical examination findings, all those things are taken together, yes.
And we'll get to those things, but for now, at least for now, that's part of the patient history, right?
That's right.
Okay. Um, was there any signs, at least in your review of the record, of accidental crush injury, sepsis, leukemia, or any other medical illnesses?
So I considered all those things because each of those diagnoses can cause retinal hemorrhages, which is something that was found in Kalen and is indicative of severe brain trauma. But it can also be caused by bleeding disorders, leukemia, sepsis, or a crush injury. The most common reports are heavy television sets landing on children's heads, and I didn't see signs of that in the laboratory evaluation, physical examination of the history.
Wow. And differential diagnosis, we talked about that with previous witnesses. We're not going to spend a lot of time on that at this juncture, but by ruling out those other causes or other possibilities, is that consistent with the differential diagnosis?
Yes.
Um, so now I'd like to kind of, and you touched on this, you kind of got there a little earlier than I was intending, but the findings in total, before you arrived at your conclusion, what were in total the things that you considered?
I considered several possibilities for what may have accounted for Kalen's presentation. I read the case. I knew what this was about. Obviously, I considered abusive head trauma, and there were several findings that we discussed that are very consistent or indicative of abusive head trauma. I considered the possibility of accidental head trauma, and certainly the most important one would be the strike against the door frame that was given about 8 days after Kalen presented to the hospital. And I think we talked about why I don't find that plausible. I also considered the possibility that an injury could have happened that no one knew, that was purely by accident. And that's super unlikely in a 2.5, 3-month-old child because they're not able to move around and cause their own injury. In a child that young, I consider the possibility of a birth injury causing this sort of thing. And birth injuries can cause small subdural hematomas, but these do not cause sudden neurologic collapse or the findings that we see on the CAT scan in Kalen. I consider the possibility of birth injury causing retinal hemorrhages, but those almost always resolve by 1 month of life. And these were severe retinal hemorrhages that existed into the 3rd month of life. I considered the possibility of rare medical problems such as a bleeding disorder. But again, this was not really a brain injury that was primarily a bleeding problem. This was an injury to the brain itself. And Kalen didn't have signs of bleeding problems. He lived another 9 months with no problems with bleeding. He had had a circumcision, no problems with bleeding. He underwent 3 surgeries in the hospital where if he had a bleeding problem, we would have expected that to show up. And we didn't see that. And his blood tests for bleeding disorders didn't really seem out of range for a child who had experienced severe brain injury. I considered the possibility of infection, but we didn't see signs of that would explain the sort of thing. The main thing would be meningitis. And meningitis is not something that goes from normal at 5 a.m. to almost going to die at 2:30 in the afternoon. Those are the main things I consider.
You mentioned something that makes me want to skip ahead in my outline is you mentioned there was an injury to the brain itself. And it makes me recall what you put in your affidavit about the example used by Dr. Stein, the example of the tomato in the container. If you could elaborate on that for the judge.
Yeah, I read Dr. Stein's testimony in the initial trial very closely because he was a clinician who cared for Kalen, and he was very strong in suggesting that this was abuse and shaking. And he used the example of a tomato being shaken in a jar. And there are some brain injuries that consist of bleeding around the brain, between the brain and the skull. And sometimes that blood can build up enough pressure to push on the brain and cause damage to the brain, either by pushing on it directly or by pushing it through one of the holes in the skull, something we call herniation. This was not that case. The primary injury to the brain was irrespective of bleeding around the brain. There may have been a little blood between the brain and the skull. Maybe there wasn't. It's not clear from my review of the CAT scans. But the main injury was to the brain itself, which is entirely consistent with shaking.
So with that being said, is it fair to say that the bleeding around the brain would have been secondary to the injury?
Sorry if I wasn't clear. I'm not sure there was bleeding around the brain. Let's assume there was. I can't tell if that happened from the same mechanism that caused the direct injury to the brain parenchyma, the brain tissue itself. I couldn't say if a small amount of bleeding could have happened after the brain was injured. What I can say is that it's not that bleeding happened and that caused all the injury to the brain itself. Something else injured that brain.
I see. Let me get back to my outline here. We were talking about the medical findings. What I was really trying to get at is the sum or summation of those medical findings. The subdural hemorrhaging, and I know you want to spit some hairs on that, and I'll allow you to. But for now, let me refer to it as subdural hemorrhaging, the retinal hemorrhaging. There was the patient history and how it changed, and then there was the absence or ruling out through your differential diagnosis these other potential causes. Is that a fair kind of summation of or recap of everything that was going
The
to
most important, it leaves out the most important thing, which is the injury to the brain itself.
Okay.
Now, bleeding around the brain, which is called a subdural hematoma, can be part of a brain injury, but in this case, it was the damage to the tissue itself, not the bleeding around it, that was the most important injury for Kalen. That is what led to his neurologic devastation and ultimately when his breathing tube was displaced to his death.
And all of those things, and the evidence of all of those things, you don't have any reason to believe, do you, as you sit here today, that all of those things were not presented to the jury that ultimately made the determination as to guilt or innocence?
No, sir. My understanding is that all those things were presented.
All right, very good. I want to talk to you now about the triad, or what's been referred to as the triad. What's your understanding of that, and what are your feelings on how that's been characterized?
Triad is not something that we use to teach residents or fellows how to recognize abusive head trauma. It is not something that is used in medical practice. I've encountered the triad only in courtrooms, and my understanding is it is a way to oversimplify how clinicians diagnose abusive head trauma. I want to make something clear. Doctors understand the importance of a diagnosis of abusive head trauma. We understand that for the child, for the family, for the person who was caring for the child at the time, I can't think of a diagnosis that I make that has more important outcomes. And I tell people they have cancer and heart attacks and stroke and that they're going to die in a month. And none of those things are as important as a diagnosis of something that really is saying somebody hurt this child. And no one approaches that kind of diagnosis with anything less than the most serious intentionality and care that you would ever do. The idea that you would use a checklist to make this diagnosis is borderline offensive to people who practice medicine because they understand what it means.
And you beat me to my next question, this notion of a checklist that if you see subdural hematoma, if you see retinal hemorrhaging, and there's altered mental state, then that's it. You stop there. You've ticked all the boxes. Let's chalk it up to shaken baby syndrome.
I personally have seen children with subdural hematomas, retinal hemorrhages, and altered mental status where I didn't even consider the possibility of shaken baby syndrome because these children presented with serious trauma, such as car crashes, with ejection, or with rollover of the vehicle. And no one said, well, they've got these 3 things on the checklist. It must be shaken baby syndrome because that would be absurd.
Okay. Short fall studies. The judge has already given me some guardrails on this. I think you and I talked about this. We're not going to spend a lot of time on it. The only reason why I think it's relevant is because the shortfall studies are indicative of the notion or the theory that minor injury can cause a secondary result that ultimately leads to the death, that mimics a shaken baby syndrome diagnosis or abusive head trauma diagnosis in an infant. Please, what are your thoughts briefly for the judge on that?
Yeah, I think you summarized it well, but if you'll permit me, at the risk of being redundant, the ultimate question that scientists are trying to answer is, because frequently in a child who presents with a devastating brain injury, someone will say, oh, well, they had this minor trauma. And certainly this minor trauma could lead to this devastating brain injury. And so if you're going to do science on that, you have to define your terms. What counts as a minor injury? How minor are we talking about? How do we define this? And children who fall from standing or off furniture or off a countertop or from hospital beds are so common that it presents the researcher with an opportunity to say, okay, this is how I define my group. What sorts of injuries do we see from this? And then we try and argue from other minor injuries, like I hit my head on the door frame, right? We don't have as many kids where that gets witnessed, and so we can't do science on that group. But the shortfall injury, most of those papers have asked, can you get a subdural hematoma from a shortfall? And I think it's fair to say the short answer is yes. The long answer is yes, but really, it's really, really, really uncommon. But we're not talking about a case of a child who experienced a subdural hematoma. We're talking about a child who may have had a subdural hematoma, but who had devastating injury to the tissue of the brain itself. And that does not happen from shortfalls or minor injuries.
And part of this assertion includes the notion that it can cause a rebleed, or in the case of the testimony that was provided yesterday by Dr. John Galasnik, the fact that it could cause an epidural hematoma that leads to an intracranial venous thrombosis, which mimics the shaken baby syndrome or abusive head trauma in infants. What are your thoughts on that?
I have so many problems with that idea, and I will try to be brief on this. Certainly, children who have subdural hematomas that we know that they're from, where I come from in Colorado, these are skiers or football players or kids in car crashes. And we certainly diagnose subdural hematomas in these kids. And not uncommonly, when they come back for care, we'll repeat their scans. And we'll see sometimes that there's brighter blood on the CAT scan, or the pocket of blood has grown in size. And people reasonably assume, okay, there's been some rebleeding into the subdural hematoma. So if the question is, can you get rebleeding into a subdural hematoma? The unequivocal answer is yes. But the assumption then that causes something that looks like abusive head trauma is completely wrong. So in those children where we know that they have subdural hematomas from football accidents or skiing, we don't send them home with helmets. We don't expect a few of them to come back neurologically devastated because they had bleeding into these subdural hematomas, which we've already said is really common. And trust me, we would know if that happened. At the University of Colorado, if we knew that a child had a subdural and we sent them home and they came back to Swedish Hospital or Lutheran or University of Massachusetts, we would get a bad Yelp review. Someone would tell us that this child had a devastating change in what happened to them after their subdural hematoma. We do not see this. And if it happened, we would see this. But most importantly, going back to Kalen's injury to his brain was not because of pressure from blood between his skull and his brain. His injury to the brain was a primary thing that happened to him when he experienced trauma, including the possibility of shaking.
So is it more apt or more appropriate, in your opinion, let me ask this before I ask that question. So is it your testimony that the science as it relates to the diagnosis of and the treatment of shaken baby syndrome or abusive head trauma in infants, that's remained the same? Is that your testimony?
To be clear, in the last 20 years, there have been advances in the science related to shaken baby syndrome. We have seen the mortality, the number of children who die after being diagnosed with shaken baby syndrome, cut in half. And that may be because we're doing a better job caring for those children. It may be because we're doing a better job of recognizing children who have more minor brain injuries. We've developed fast MRI to avoid exposure to ionizing radiation. We've developed better ways of recognizing seizures and treating them. We have made important advances. Does our understanding of what it takes to cause findings associated with shaken baby syndrome, has that changed significantly in the last 20 years? I can't think of a way that's important to this case.
So with that being said, the understanding of shaken baby syndrome or abusive head trauma has not changed, in your opinion. This reference of new, quote unquote, new science, is it more apt or more appropriate maybe to refer to it as a new theory of a mechanism or a new theory of or hypothesis of the manner in which these injuries may be caused?
I've certainly seen, I've read about cases where people invoke new hypotheses about how something occurred and suggest that it is new science. I believe that there are scientific advances related to shaken baby syndrome, but I don't believe that I read anything in this case that was real new science that made us understand that this could have happened in a way other than significant trauma that we weren't told about.
Let's talk about what was available back in 2000. I mean, the science was available back in 2000 to detect a cerebral thrombosis. Is that fair to say?
The concept of cerebral sinus thrombosis has been around for decades, and certainly the idea that that may have led to findings that could be confused with shaken baby syndrome has been around for decades, certainly 20 years. Since the original trial, new science has come up about cerebral sinus thrombosis, including a paper that I wrote and others that are better papers that suggest that it is unlikely to cause the findings that we see in this case or things that could be confused for shaken baby syndrome. In fact, the science really suggests that clots in the veins in the brain, or cerebral sinus thrombosis, are very likely to be an after effect, a result of trauma to the brain, not of a cause of something that looks like trauma to the brain.
And my last question on this notion of shortfall, or in other words, minor trauma that leads to a symptom or a cause that mimics shaken baby. And that question would be the studies that relate to shortfalls. If you had to divide them up, say I have two buckets, the bucket with case studies and the bucket with clinical research studies, and I know that that's oversimplifying the research studies. There's some nuance to that, but for the sake of my question, two differences, two different buckets: case studies versus clinical research, either prospective or respective, prospective or retrospective. What bucket would you put the majority of these case studies in as it relates to shaken baby or shortfalls?
So if you get training in clinical research, on day one, you'll get a list of study methods, and they'll generally rank them as better or worse. That's a little bit like ranking the tools in your toolbox as better or worse. There's no better tool or worse tool. It depends on the job you're trying to do. Case studies can be useful for certain things. Most importantly, a case study is useful to determine.
See that?
No.
Everywhere. I'm sorry. A bug literally just dive bombed to my face,
Oh,
and I didn't want y'all to think that I was having some.
I tried to kill it a second ago.
No, it went straight. I really think it went through my mouth.
So a case study does have important uses. Sometimes it's just educational. Oh my gosh, we haven't seen this disease in 20 years. We saw this great, interesting case. This is a great way for students who haven't seen this before to learn about it. Early in the course of a disease, COVID toes, COVID thromboses. The first time someone saw that, writing up that one case and saying, dear clinicians, maybe you should think about this in the future, super important. In our field of child abuse pediatrics, a well-designed case study can show you this is possible. So for example, probably the best one is a videotape. A family was watching a movie, and I think it was a 3-year-old or a 5-year-old saw their infant sibling on a mat and said, I want to roll my brother or sister over. And the family said, okay. And the 3-year-old rolled up, and the kid's arm got caught behind him, and you could actually hear a snap. And the child started crying, and they took the child to the hospital, and the child had a broken bone. If you have the question, is it possible for a 3-year-old to cause a broken humerus in their 3-month-old brother? That question has now been answered definitively. It is possible. But it doesn't tell you how often it happens, how important it happens. And one problem with case studies is that you really have to trust the authors to include all the relevant information. And if someone doesn't know what they're doing, or if they're committing scientific misconduct, they can leave out really important findings in their case studies, which really affects how you interpret those case studies. And you have to rely on being able to read those cases. Now, other scientific methods would include a prospective study where we define what counts as a minor injury, what's a shortfall, what injuries are we looking for, what testing are we going to do. These are often called hypothesis-driven studies, or there's more robust methods. So in the end, a case study is probably still most commonly the least useful thing, but there are some things that can be very useful.
Very good. You mentioned being more robust, and as part of that robustness, does it include peer reviewing?
When you publish your results, it's very important that they be peer reviewed and that your methods include enough information that if someone wanted to do the same experiment again, they could do that.
And what about the opportunity for practitioners to comment on that study?
Yes, there's not a simple yes, no, this is right, this is wrong. Nothing's proven in science. Things are only disproven in science. So the conversation that goes on after a study is published is part of deciding how important that study is.
There was testimony yesterday by Dr. John Galesnik that there are, in his estimation, hundreds of case studies out there on abusive head trauma. Is that something that you would agree with or disagree with?
There are certainly hundreds of research publications related to abusive head trauma.
Those studies, they're not all created equally, are they?
That's correct, sir.
And again, for the reason that you just testified to about whether or not it's peer reviewed, if it's robust enough, if there is an opportunity for a practitioner to comment on it. I guess what I'm getting at, my ultimate question is, if someone were inclined to, and I'm not saying that that's the case in this particular case, but if someone were inclined to, out of those hundreds of studies, they could very well cherry pick certain studies that assert or set forth a certain opinion that they wish to set forth.
Yes, I find this one of the most difficult things of dealing with science in the courtroom. Most people in courtrooms have lives and jobs that are not to read all the literature in child abuse pediatrics. And so to ask, how do we decide? Is it Dr. Lindbergh? Is it Dr. Galaznik? We don't want to say who's got more gray hair, who's got a better outfit, who went to the better school. That's not a reliable way. But you can't read all the methods for every single paper to decide. And so I try my best to communicate what are some problems with other people's studies, what are the studies that have been accepted by the most prestigious organizations, people who do their best, people who actually care for children, the people who actually do the work every day, compared to someone who might the only reason they're testifying is because, or the only reason they're talking about a study is because, they spend most of their time in the courtroom.
Yeah. Let's get back to your conclusions or the determinations that you made in this particular case. Your conclusion, and I have it in quotes here, is there was severe abusive head trauma caused to Kaylin Garner in this case. Is that a fair assessment of your conclusion?
Yes, that's still my conclusion today.
Why do you characterize it as, this may be redundant, but you characterize it as severe? I think you've already covered it and the reasons why. I don't know I have to even spend any time on that. Let me move on. And what I do want to talk about is during your review, you looked at and you mentioned Dr. Stein's information, his determinations, particularly the tomato in the container example. But did you also look at Dr. Patricia Moore's report and the determinations as well?
I did review Dr. Moore's testimony.
Let's take those individually, please. Dr. Stein concluded that there was violent shaking of the body with interior and posterior movement of the head, either multiple or repeated times, causing the brain to shear the neurons and to swell and bleed behind the eyes. Do you agree with that based on your entire review of the file in its entirety?
Um, sorry. I'm not sure I would have been as definitive about whether the shaking was anterior or posterior. And I think there are other forms of violence that could have caused this other than shaking. Being thrown down, thrown violently against a soft surface. I suppose it's possible. I certainly think that shaking is the most likely mechanism that could have caused this. And I agree almost completely with Dr. Stein's conclusions. But, in the last 20 years, the changing of the name from shaken baby syndrome to abusive head trauma, does demonstrate the consensus that while we agree this is violence, while we agree this is trauma, we as clinicians don't spend as much time figuring out if it's shaking per se or slamming or throwing.
I understand. And if you recall, do you remember whether or not Dr. Stein was a pediatrician with the Texas Children's Hospital here in Texas?
My understanding is that he was a pediatric intensivist. He worked in the pediatric intensive care unit at Texas Children's, if memory serves.
Any reason to disagree with my representation that he had 25 plus years in the field at the time?
No, sir.
All right. In your opinion, in your professional opinion, who is best suited to opine about diagnosing and treating shaken baby syndrome and or abusive head trauma in infants? A clinical practitioner who diagnoses and treats that on a regular basis, or some biomechanical engineer or law professor?
I don't think a biomedical engineer is qualified to make this diagnosis, but I don't want to get trapped into saying that I agree with everything someone says because they're an experienced clinician. I will note that in his medical records, every emergency physician, every neurosurgeon, every neurologist, every emergency physician, every general surgeon, every pediatric intensive care unit, doctor, and every radiologist who reviewed the case concluded that the child had experienced abusive head trauma or shaken baby syndrome.
I'd like to shift gears to Dr. Moore's, both her written determinations in the file and also her testimony at trial. She concluded that there was some type of direct force to the head, whether it be shaking through a shaking mechanism or not, and that there was some type of acceleration injury to cause the problems in the brain and the eyes. Do you agree or disagree with that assertion?
I do, with the understanding that acceleration injury is an extremely broad term.
And during your review of the case file materials, Dr. Moore, in being questioned at trial, answered this question in this way. When asked if the injuries were consistent with a closed head trauma due to shaking, she answered yes. Do you have any reason to, based on your review of the file, to disagree with her answer there?
No, the injuries were consistent with that sort of injury.
During the trial, she also, in response to this question, stated in the affirmative. When asked if it would have had an immediate effect, her answer was yes. What is your take on her assessment?
I agree. The amount of damage done to this brain tissue would have been something that a layperson would have appreciated within minutes.
And you've provided the district attorney's office with an affidavit. And is that affidavit essentially a summary of your testimony here today?
Yes, sir.
Let's talk about another topic, and that topic is a reality for expert witnesses like yourself, and that's payment of your fees and reimbursement of your expenses. We have a contract, we have an agreement in that regard, do we not?
Yes, sir.
And what is the hourly rate that you're charging the district attorney's office?
I charged $500 an hour for activities that I could conduct on my own schedule in my pajamas. I charged $650 an hour up to 10 hours a day for activities that are scheduled.
And there's also the reimbursement for your expenses, correct?
Correct.
All right. Is that standard in this line of work, this type of?
It's consistent for emergency physicians. It compensates for it. If I were to, instead of testifying, treat patients in an emergency department, it's close to what I would receive from them.
And that compensation or reimbursement, has that in any way affected your determination in this case?
No, sir.
Do you have any conflict of interest, a personal stake in the outcome of this trial?
No, sir.
In fact, you've signed a conflict of interest disclosure form, correct?
Correct.
Let's move on. Well, let's talk about this. Wow. Moved on a lot quicker than I thought. The studies was the next thing on my my list. I think as I work through this outline, looks like we talked about those. Let's see if there's anything that I left out here. Nope. Oh, here's the next thing here is injuries associated with shaken baby syndrome and abusive head trauma in infants. There was testimony yesterday from Dr. Galasnik that there would be or should be either a broken neck or a rib fracture or some ligament damage associated with a case of shaken baby syndrome or abusive head trauma in an infant. Is it necessary to always have that in conjunction with the shaken baby?
That suggestion's outrageous. The best study that performed MRI studies of children who experienced abusive head trauma did not find injuries to the neck in all of those children. And Kalen did not have any tests to see if he had injuries of his neck, except for a physical exam looking on the outside and an autopsy that was performed 9 months later, when the sorts of injuries that are alleged to occur commonly in abusive head trauma would have healed at that point. So I find that not convincing.
And just to follow up on that, is it your testimony that it's possible to shake a baby to the point of serious injury without having those, either the neck injury or the fracture or the ligament damage?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Biomechanical modeling is the next topic I'd like to talk about. Instructive or not?
Absolutely useless.
Okay. I'm assuming you're referring to the limitations with regard to biofidelity?
The human brain is one of the most sophisticated and complicated things in the known universe. To try and represent this like we all experienced in high school physics, like a pendulum, where we know how long a neck is and how heavy the pendulum is, and we can experience the forces that happen to that brain for a known mechanism, is ridiculous. No one, there's no biomechanical engineer on the planet that could watch a replay of an NFL football game and see two players hit each other and know what's going to happen, whether one of those players is going to have a concussion or a subdural hematoma or anything else. And I mean, now take that and add the fact that everybody's different, children grow and they develop. And, you know, in shaking, there are multiple episodes of force that goes back and forth. You know, someone who just did one thing would say you can't break a paperclip by bending the metal. After all, a paperclip is bent when it turns into when it becomes a paperclip. But no one who's been bored and fidgeted as much as I would suggest that you can't break a paperclip by bending the metal, because metal fatigues. You just, I mean, there's this story. I can't find it, so it may just be a story. It may not have actually happened, but it's instructive to think about it. Was that some brilliant mathematicians and biomechanicists studied carefully and proved that bumblebees can't fly. They're too heavy. Their wings are too small. Now, do you counteract that by looking at their math? Do you see what they've done to experience it? No, you just show them a bumblebee flying and say, your biomechanical model does not make sense. Anyone who says you can't shake a baby hard enough to hurt their brain is not someone who, like I have, has had people confess to them that they shook a baby or that they harmed a baby. No one would, you know, see a child that's normal at 1 minute and then 8 hours later is neurologically devastated and say, oh, maybe it was this minor thing where they hit against the door. Here, let me show you the math. It just doesn't make sense with what we see in the real world.
Is it fair to say that biomechanical modeling may be better suited for other applications, say for instance, accident reconstruction, or right, to reconstruct an accident or an incident at like a industrial refinery?
I'm sure I shouldn't go overboard. I'm not trying to say that the whole field of biomechanical engineering is useless. There are certainly things that can do, but for someone to say, I've shown you the math, you can't hurt a child by shaking it, it just does not convince me.
Because unlike with the accident reconstruction where you've got skid marks for a certain distance, you can test the strength of the tensile strength of the metal in the vehicles, or in a pipeline industrial facility where you know what the pressure was going through that pipe before it exploded. There are unknowns when it comes to modeling infants.
Absolutely. Abusive head trauma is far more complicated than those examples you gave. And those examples are not meant to say what's going to happen in one case. They're going to say, generally speaking, if you put a crumple zone in your Volvo, you're less likely to have an injury. But they're not going to say it's impossible. They're just going to say this will reduce the force, this will improve survivability, but it doesn't tell you what's going to happen in the next crash that comes into my emergency department.
Animal studies, crash test dummies, are those apples to apples comparisons with infants?
Animal studies aren't perfect, but I think there are some useful animal studies that show that you can have brain injury and eye injury from shaking. And of course, there's the literature on adult victims of shaking, which demonstrate that you can get subdural hematomas and retinal hemorrhages and brain damage.
Kalen's brain damage in this case, you talked about it, but if the court willing judgment, I think it's worth mentioning again. Kalen's brain damage was not the result of pressure from a subdural hematoma pushing the brain out of the skull, or what's referred to as herniation, right?
Correct. Sorry, there was one read that suggested maybe there was some herniation, which would not have been from a subdural pushing on the brain, but may have been the swelling in the brain injury itself.
Okay, and that was the tomato.
And I'm not sure if there was herniation.
And that was part of the discussion about the tomato in the container. So I'll move on. Dr. Galaznik yesterday theorized that a possible alternative cause in this particular case was it a epidural hematoma that ultimately led to intracranial venous thrombosis, a clot. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, if the epidural hematoma would have been significant in this case, I would have expected that to have been read on the CAT scan, because while there are small epidural hematomas, an epidural hematoma that's going to put pressure on the brain would be big enough to be seen on the CAT scan. And again, a cerebral sinus thrombosis wouldn't cause all the injury throughout the brain that we saw on the very first CAT scan that Kalen had.
And speaking of CAT scan, I understand in your line of work, you would frequently refer or consult with neuroradiologists, right?
Yes, sir.
In order to review and make a determination as to what is actually shown on that CT or that CAT scan, correct?
Right.
While you may be able to make some, you may be able to, you may have an opinion, but who, in your opinion, would be better suited for making a determination based on that CT or that CAT scan, a neuroradiologist or some other practitioner?
I don't want to overgeneralize. In general, a pediatric neuroradiologist is extremely well trained, and that's their main job, is to interpret pediatric CAT scans and MRIs. And if I have a question, I definitely have a very low threshold to talk to my pediatric neuroradiologist.
And that would include making a determination as to whether or not a CAT scan shows a transverse sinus thrombosis that resulted from an epidural bleed that triggered brain swelling. Is that fair to say?
I mean, I'd like to think I could probably, in most cases, tell whether there's a transverse sinus thrombosis. But if you had two doctors who disagreed and one was a pediatric neuroradiologist, smart money would probably be on them.
All right, very good. The next question in my outline is to kind of walk through the 2025 narration American Academy of Pediatrics reaffirmation, but you co-authored that, right? So
I was not a co-author on the 2025 study. I worked with Dr. Narang in a previous study. Let's please not walk through all 7,000 references.
I don't think the judge would allow me to do that, but that would have been the 2016
I think that's the one, yes.
study that you worked with him on. But essentially the 2025 just reaffirmed the generally accepted practice as it relates to diagnosing shaken baby syndrome and abusive head trauma in infants, correct?
Nothing's perfect, but I consider the Narang 2025 consensus statement to be the most current statement about abuse of head trauma, and it's been endorsed by many, many organizations. And so I would take everything in that paper very seriously.
All right. And lastly, the theory behind and the diagnosis of shaken baby syndrome and abuse of the head trauma in infants, that in your opinion remains generally accepted by physicians who encounter that type of abuse on a regular basis.
It's not just my opinion. We did a survey on it, and clinicians who are apt to treat children who might have abusive head trauma overwhelmingly agree that shaking can cause brain injury, subdural hematomas, and retinal hemorrhages.
Very good. Thank you, Dr. Lindberg. Judge, I'll pass the points.
Thank you, Mr. Coleman.
Thank you, Your Honor.
So the testimony ended. Dr. Lindberg stood firm that Kaylin's death was no accident. But here's the question. Do you side with the medical experts or the possibility of a scientific error? Comment below. Team prosecution or team defense? Should a man's freedom depend on a diagnosis that's still being debated today? If this case got you thinking, hit like. Share this with anyone who loves a deep dive into courtroom ethics.